I retired at 62, thinking I'd finally earned the quiet. 31 years in civil engineering, and all I wanted was a place where the only deadlines were sunrise and sunset. So I sold the house in Columbus, where my daughter Megan had grown up, and I bought a small cabin property up in the Smoky Mountains, 4 acres, a creek running behind the tree line, a wraparound porch where I could drink my coffee and not talk to a single soul unless I chose to. I named it mine, not officially, not with a sign or anything like that, but in the way that matters. I paid for it, I picked it, I planned my whole next chapter around it. My wife Ellen had passed 3 years before that. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I rattled around our old house in Columbus for almost 2 years, and it nearly swallowed me whole. The grief counselor I saw, a kind woman named Dr. Peterson. She told me that sometimes the best thing a person can do is change the geography. Get out of the rooms where all the loss happened. Start somewhere new. She was right. The cabin was the first place I'd slept soundly since the funeral. Megan called me every Sunday. She was 34 by then, living in Charlotte with her husband, a man named Cody. They'd been married 4 years. I liked Cody well enough when I first met him. Charming, confident, knew how to work a room. He sold commercial real estate and made decent money at it. The kind of guy who always had a handshake ready and a smile that showed all his teeth. I trusted that smile longer than I should have. The first Sunday Megan called with what she called some news. I was sitting on my porch watching a doe pick her way through the creek bank. She told me that Cody's parents, his father Leonard and his mother Vivian, had hit a rough patch. Leonard had taken an early retirement package from his company, and Vivian had never worked outside the home. They'd been living in a house they owned outright in Knoxville, but according to Megan, they'd made some bad decisions with the money from Leonard's payout. Something about a timeshare investment that went sideways, credit card debt they'd quietly accumulated, and a second mortgage they couldn't sustain. They might need to sell the Knoxville house, Megan told me. I said that was a shame. I meant it. Losing your home at that stage of life is genuinely hard. I felt for them. The thing is, Dad, Megan said, and there was a pause I should have paid more attention to, they don't really have anywhere to go. I made a sympathetic sound. I asked if Cody's sister could take them in. Megan said the sister had a 2-bedroom apartment in Nashville and a newborn. What about Cody? I asked, another pause. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I put my coffee mug down. She told me, and she said it carefully, like she'd rehearsed the order of the words, that she and Cody had been thinking about it, and they wondered whether Leonard and Vivian might stay at the cabin with me for a little while. Just until they figured out their finances. Just until they got stable. I didn't say yes. I want to be very clear about that. I told Megan I needed to think about it. I told her the cabin wasn't really set up for extra people. I told her I'd moved up here specifically for the solitude. She said she understood completely, that she wasn't trying to pressure me, that it was just an idea they were exploring. I should have ended the conversation there. I should have said no, clearly and without apology. The same way I would have said it to anyone who asked to move into my home uninvited. But Megan was crying a little by the end of the call, quietly, the way she always cried, like she was trying not to, and I thought about how much she loved Cody, and how hard it would be for her if his parents ended up in a bad situation. I thought about Ellen, who would have known exactly what to say, and would have said it with more grace than I ever could. I told Megan I'd call her back in a few days. I called her back in 3 days and said they could come for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, I said. That was the number I gave her. I was specific about it. I told her I needed my space respected, my routine respected, and that after 6 weeks we'd reassess. She thanked me so warmly that I felt good about it for about 48 hours. Leonard and Vivian arrived on a Tuesday in March, with 2 SUVs packed to the roof. I remember watching them pull up the gravel drive from my porch, and thinking, in a completely neutral, observational way, that this was a lot of luggage for 6 weeks. Leonard was a big man, broad-shouldered, the kind of guy who took up space without seeming to notice. Vivian was small and quick-moving, with sharp eyes that took inventory of everything. She hugged me at the door and called me the famous Warren, which I thought was an odd thing to say. And then she walked past me into the cabin and started looking around with the expression of someone calculating square footage. "This is wonderful," she said, though the way she said it carried the faint implication that it could be more wonderful. Leonard shook my hand and clapped me on the shoulder. "Appreciate you, buddy. Really do." I showed them to the guest room, the larger of the two spare rooms, with its own bathroom. The other spare room I used as a home office. Leonard looked at the guest room and nodded. Vivian looked at it and asked if the mattress was firm or soft. The first week was fine, mostly fine. They kept to themselves in the mornings. Leonard liked to watch cable news at a volume that carried through the walls, and Vivian reorganized the pantry without asking me. But I let it go. I told myself that people have different habits. I told myself that Ellen would have told me to be patient. The second week, Cody and Megan drove up from Charlotte for the weekend. I was glad to see Megan, I always am. She helped me make breakfast Saturday morning, and we talked on the porch while the coffee brewed, just the two of us for a little while, and it felt like the old days. Then Cody came out and sat down, and he had the look of a man who was about to say something he'd already decided on. "Dad," he said. He'd started calling me that, which I'd never asked him to do, but I hadn't stopped it either. "I just want to say how much it means that you've done this. For my parents. For us." I nodded. I said it was temporary, just to keep the framing clear. He nodded back in a way that suggested he'd heard me but wasn't really listening. That afternoon, I was in my office going through some paperwork when I heard Vivian's voice from down the hall, showing Megan around the cabin with a proprietary energy that made me stop what I was doing. "The light in here is really something in the mornings," I heard her say. "If we put a reading chair in that corner by the window, it would be perfect." I heard Megan say, in a tone I couldn't fully interpret. That night, after dinner, Cody casually mentioned that his parents' situation in Knoxville was looking more permanent than expected. The house was already under contract. The buyer wanted to close fast. "So they'll need to stay a little longer," he said, not as a question. I looked at him across the dinner table. I looked at Megan. She was looking at her plate. "How much longer?" I said. Cody shrugged with one shoulder. "Just until they find something." "Find something where?" "Around here, probably. This area's great. Good community, no state income tax, lower cost of living than Charlotte." I said I understood all of that. I said that didn't answer my question. He smiled at me. "We'll figure it out, Dad. Don't stress." I did not sleep well that night. Monday morning, Cody and Megan drove back to Charlotte. That afternoon, Leonard sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and told me that he thought the cabin had a lot of untapped potential. He said with some work, the back acreage could support a second structure. A guest cottage, maybe. He said this with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent the weekend thinking it over. I told Leonard that I had no interest in adding a second structure. He looked at me like I'd said something mildly puzzling. "Something to think about," he said, and smiled. "I want to explain something about why I didn't just tell them to leave right then. I know that's what most people would have done. I know it's what I should have done. But the situation had layers to it that made it harder than it sounds. Megan was caught in the middle. She loved Cody, and Cody was the kind of man who made his unhappiness her problem. If I threw his parents out, she was the one who'd bear the weight of that. I'd watched her spend 4 years walking on eggshells around his moods, and I hadn't said anything because she was an adult and it wasn't my place. But I wasn't willing to blow up her marriage over my cabin, even if the cabin was mine and the situation was wrong. So I decided to do something different. I decided to be very quiet and very patient and very observant. A few weeks before Leonard and Vivian had arrived, I'd had a security system installed. Standard stuff, nothing fancy. 2 exterior cameras covering the driveway and the back property line, and a small interior camera in the main living area that I'd had put in after a break-in 2 properties down the road the previous fall. I hadn't mentioned the cameras to anyone, not because I was hiding them. They were right there if you looked, but because it hadn't come up and nobody had asked. I started paying closer attention. Vivian, I noticed, had a habit of going through my desk in the office when I wasn't in it. I noticed this first when I found a folder of my financial documents moved to a different position than I'd left it. I checked it again more carefully. The folder with my property deed and my insurance policy had been opened. Pages inside had been shifted. I didn't say anything. I put a small piece of tape on the back of the folder, hidden against the spine. The next time she went through the desk, the tape was broken. Leonard had started making calls from the back porch in the evenings, and while I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, sounds carry on 4 acres when there's nothing else to absorb them. I heard pieces of conversations. He was talking to someone about property values in Sevier County. He mentioned the acreage. He mentioned the old man. I assumed that was me, in a tone that was not unkind but was not respectful either. In the 4th week, Vivian asked me to let her and Leonard take the second bedroom, my office, because Leonard's back was giving him trouble and he needed space to stretch in the mornings. She made it sound perfectly reasonable. She made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. I told her I needed that room. She gave me a look. "Warren, it's just a bedroom. It's my office," I said. "You could set up an office anywhere." There was something in her voice, patient, slightly condescending, the way you'd talk to someone who was making a fuss over nothing, that told me she'd already decided this was how it was going to go. She was just waiting for me to realize it. I said I'd think about it. I didn't intend to give it to her. But I wanted to think about how I was going to handle things, and I needed a few more days. Those few days were the ones that mattered. Leonard, apparently emboldened by the conversation about the office, started taking short walks around the perimeter of the property, with a measuring tape. I watched this from the kitchen window on a Wednesday afternoon. He was out by the tree line, measuring something, writing numbers in a small notebook. At one point he stopped and looked back at the cabin, with the kind of expression I'd seen on buyers at property auctions, calculating, assessing, deciding what something was worth. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, and I thought, these people are not here temporarily. These people are planning. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Gary Aldrich, out of Sevierville, a man I've used for estate planning for several years and who does not waste words. I told him what was happening. I told him about the deed folder, the tape, the measuring tape. I told him that Cody had never framed this stay as temporary in anything written, and I had no formal documentation from anyone about the terms of the arrangement. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Warren, in Tennessee, if a person has been residing in a property for a sustained period with the owner's tacit permission and without a formal agreement, they can establish grounds for what's called a tenancy at will, which means you cannot simply ask them to leave. You have to formally terminate the tenancy, and, if they refuse to go, you'd be looking at an eviction proceeding." I set my mug down very carefully. He said I hadn't crossed that threshold yet. We were still inside the window where this could be handled cleanly, but I needed to act soon and I needed to document everything. He told me to write down every incident, every date, every conversation I could remember. He told me that the security footage was valuable and I should preserve it. He told me to get a formal, written notice, drafted, signed, and delivered while the law was still entirely on my side. I asked him how long I had. He said, "Sooner is better than later." That night, Vivian made dinner without asking. She'd started doing that, cooking big meals in my kitchen, using my groceries, as if she were simply the woman of the house. And while we were eating, she brought up the office again. She said she and Leonard had been thinking about it, and they thought the best use of the space would be if they took it as a second bedroom, while a small desk was moved to the corner of the living room for me. Leonard nodded. I ate my food. I said, "I'll think about it," in the same tone I'd used before, which they had decided meant yes eventually. It didn't mean that. The next morning I went into my office before either of them was awake, and I went through every piece of footage the security system had saved. The interior camera, the exterior cameras, 3 weeks of recordings. I sat there for 2 hours with a cup of coffee and I watched. What I watched was this: Vivian, on 6 separate occasions over 3 weeks, entering my office and going through my desk. Leonard, on 4 occasions, making phone calls on the back porch with body language that was nothing like a man discussing the weather. A conversation between the two of them in the living room, caught by the interior camera, in which Vivian said, clearly enough that the audio captured it, "He's not going to do anything, he's too nice," And Leonard said, "We just need another month." Another month. Not another 6 weeks. Another month, stacked on top of the time they'd already been there. I called Gary back. I told him what the footage showed. He told me to send him the relevant clips, and he'd prepare the formal notice. I also called Megan. This was the call I'd been dreading more than any of it. Megan is my daughter. She is, in a lot of ways, the best thing Ellen and I ever did. She has her mother's warmth and her mother's generosity. And Cody had spent 4 years using both of those qualities as conveniences. I was not going to pretend anymore that I hadn't noticed. She answered on the second ring. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not angry at her. I told her that what I was about to say was not about her and Cody's marriage. That was her life and her choice. But I needed her to hear the truth about what had been happening in my home. I told her about the desk. I told her about the tape. I told her about the measuring tape and the notebook and Leonard's phone calls. And then I told her about the camera footage and what Vivian had said. There was a very long silence. Then Megan said, "Dad, just my name," in the voice she uses when she doesn't have words yet. I told her I wasn't asking her to do anything right now. I told her Gary was preparing a formal notice that would be served to Leonard and Vivian, and that it would give them 30 days to vacate per Tennessee state law. I told her I wanted her to know before it happened, because I love her, and she deserves to not be blindsided. She cried. Not quietly this time, real crying, the kind that meant she'd already known something was wrong and had been holding it in. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said she hadn't known they were going through my things. I believe her. Megan does not lie to me. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "I've been unhappy for a long time, Dad, and this isn't the first time he's done something like this without telling me." I didn't push her on it. I just told her I was here, whatever she needed. That didn't change. Gary served the formal notice 3 days later. A certified letter, delivered by a process server, addressed to Leonard and to Vivian individually. 30 days notice of termination of tenancy, per Tennessee Code annotated, 66-28-512, legal, clean, unambiguous. I was in my office when I heard Leonard open the letter. The sound that followed was not a loud sound. It was a quiet sound, actually, a held breath, almost, and then footsteps going quickly toward the guest room, and the door closing. An hour later, Vivian knocked on my office door. She came in and sat down across from me with the letter in her hand and an expression I hadn't seen on her before. The inventory-taking sharpness was gone. She looked like someone who'd just realized the board they'd been standing on was not as solid as they thought. She said, "Warren, I think there's been a misunderstanding." I said, "What's been misunderstood?" She said that they hadn't meant to overstep, that everything had been done in the spirit of trying to be helpful, that she'd only gone into the office to look for 6 times. Looking for a pen. I didn't raise my voice. I've found in my life that the times I most needed to not raise my voice were the times it mattered most to keep it level. I said, "Vivian, I have cameras." She went very still. I said, "I have the footage from the interior camera in this room, from the exterior cameras, and audio from several conversations that took place in the common areas of my home. My attorney has reviewed it and found it relevant. The notice stands." She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face that I couldn't quite name. Not shame exactly, but the near cousin of it. The recognition that she'd been seen. She stood up and left without saying anything else. Leonard came to see me later that evening. He sat down across from me with the straightforward manner of a man who conducts business and knows when a deal has gone sideways. He didn't try the misunderstanding approach. He said he thought things had gotten complicated and asked if there was any room to extend the timeline. I said, 30 days. He said, "We may need 45. I said 30 days, and if you'd like to avoid any further legal involvement, I'd suggest we keep this straightforward. He studied me for a moment. I think he was deciding whether I was bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. He nodded once and stood up. Understood, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 6 weeks. Cody called me that night from Charlotte. He was angry, not loudly, not explosively, but in that cold, controlled way that I imagine is very effective on people who need his approval. He told me I was making things very difficult for his family. He said he was disappointed in me. He said he'd expected better. I let him say all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I said, Cody, your parents went through my documents. On camera. While I was in this house. If you'd like to see the footage, Gary can share the relevant clips. Other than that, I don't have much to add. Another silence. A different kind this time. He hung up without saying goodbye. Leonard and Vivian were gone in 26 days. They packed everything they'd arrived with. Plus, I noticed, 2 throw pillows from the guest room that belonged to me, which I chose not to pursue, and loaded up the same 2 SUVs. Leonard shook my hand on the way out. He didn't say much. Vivian didn't look at me. I stood on the porch and watched them drive down the gravel and disappear around the bend, and then I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. It was the best quiet I'd heard in months. Megan came up 2 weeks later, alone. She sat on the porch with me for a long weekend, and we talked more honestly than we'd talked in years. She told me things about her marriage that she'd been carrying quietly, the way she always carries things. I listened. I didn't tell her what to do. That's not my job. My job is to be her father, which means I'm here when she needs me, and I stay out of the way when she doesn't. What I will say is that she's made some decisions since then. Difficult ones, the kind that take courage. I'm proud of her. I always have been, but now I'm proud of her in a new way. The way you're proud of someone when you watch them choose themselves. The cabin is mine again. Fully, completely mine. The mornings are quiet. The creek runs behind the tree line like it always has. I drink my coffee on the porch and watch the light change, and I don't talk to a single soul unless I choose to. Some people, when I've told this story to friends, say I should have just said no from the beginning. Maybe. Probably. In a perfect version of myself, I would have. But I also think there's something I learned from letting it play out the way it did. Sometimes you need to see what someone actually is, not what they present, not what they claim, but what they do when they think they're not being watched. Leonard and Vivian showed me exactly who they were, and Cody showed me what I'd already suspected, but hadn't let myself believe. My daughter deserved to know the truth. The camera didn't lie, and my home is still mine.